"Ma'am, you need to leave. Right now." The words sliced cleanly through the warm hum of the charity gala, so calm and polite that they somehow echoed louder than a shout. Crystal chandeliers scattered golden light across the ballroom, catching every polished wine glass, every diamond necklace, every perfectly pressed tuxedo. A string quartet played softly beneath the soaring ceilings of the Whitmore Grand Hotel in downtown Chicago, filling the room with elegant melodies that seemed untouched by ordinary life. Nearly 400 guests drifted between marble columns and towering floral arrangements, laughing over million-dollar donations and business partnerships that could reshape entire industries. At the edge of the ballroom stood Naomi Brooks, balancing a silver serving tray with practiced hands that never trembled, at least not until now. She wore the same tailored black server uniform as every other member of the catering staff, her name stitched neatly above the pocket in simple white thread. She had spent the last 7 hours weaving quietly through crowds who barely noticed her existence, replacing empty champagne flutes before anyone asked, offering warm smiles that rarely received one in return, and making herself nearly invisible because invisible employees were usually the ones who kept their jobs. Then everything changed. A sharply dressed guest stepped backward without looking and brushed against her tray. One crystal flute tipped sideways, its sparkling contents splashing across the polished floor only inches from a custom Italian leather shoe. A brief silence spread outward like ripples across still water. The guest looked down, frowned, then slowly lifted his eyes toward Naomi as though he had discovered something offensive hidden beneath the expensive decorations. "She doesn't belong in this room," he said loudly enough for nearby conversations to stop. "Someone should teach the staff where they're supposed to stand." Several heads turned. Conversations faded. The violinists continued playing, but even the music suddenly felt distant. Naomi immediately lowered her tray and reached for a linen towel. "I'm very sorry, sir," she said with genuine calm. "I'll clean it right away." She knelt for only a second before another voice interrupted. "That's enough." Two security officers approached from opposite sides of the ballroom with measured steps, their expressions carefully professional. One of them spoke quietly, almost apologetically. "Ma'am, we've been instructed to escort you outside." Naomi looked up, confused. "Outside?" "Yes, ma'am." Around them, expensive watches glimmered beneath chandelier light as guests watched without pretending not to. Some whispered behind raised glasses. Others simply observed with detached curiosity, already treating the moment like another piece of evening entertainment. Across the ballroom, Richard Whitmore stood near the stage where the night's headline charity auction would begin in less than 10 minutes. The billionaire host wore a midnight blue tuxedo tailored so perfectly it seemed sculpted rather than sewn. Board members surrounded him. Donors waited for photographs. His schedule had been planned down to the minute. When one of his event managers leaned over and quietly explained that a server was being removed after causing a disturbance, Richard barely glanced across the ballroom. His eyes landed on Naomi for less than 2 seconds before returning to the investors standing beside him. "Handle it," he replied without emotion. Naomi heard neither his words nor his tone, but somehow she felt the weight of that decision anyway. She slowly handed her serving tray to another waitress, smoothed the front of her uniform, and nodded once to the security officers. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. She simply followed them toward the towering ballroom doors as hundreds of silent eyes watched her walk away. Just before she reached the exit, something caught her attention. On the stage, beneath the focused gallery lights, an enormous oil painting rested upon an elegant mahogany easel beneath a velvet cover, waiting to become the centerpiece of the evening's record-breaking charity auction. Naomi stopped for the briefest moment. Her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Something about that painting didn't feel right. The cool night air greeted Naomi. Brooks the moment the ballroom doors closed behind her, replacing the soft music and polished laughter with the distant sound of traffic rolling along Michigan Avenue. She paused beneath the grand stone entrance of the Whitmore Grand Hotel, taking one slow breath before wrapping her light jacket a little tighter around herself. The city shimmered beyond the valet lane, its glass towers reflecting ribbons of white and amber light across rain-damp pavement. She should have kept walking. Every sensible part of her mind told her to leave, call for a rideshare, and forget everything that had happened inside. Yet her thoughts refused to settle. They remained fixed on the covered painting waiting beneath the auction lights. It was a feeling she had learned never to ignore. Long before she carried serving trays through luxury hotels, Naomi had spent 4 years studying art conservation at Northwestern University. She had fallen in love not only with beautiful paintings, but with the stories hidden beneath cracked varnish, faded pigments, and centuries of careful restoration. Her professors often reminded students that genuine masterpieces always revealed quiet truths to patient eyes. A brushstroke placed half an inch too high, a pigment that had not existed during the claimed period, a signature applied over fresh varnish instead of beneath it. Tiny details that most people overlooked often carried the loudest answers. Naomi had been one of the strongest students in her program until life interrupted plans that talent alone could not protect. During her senior year, her mother, Evelyn Brooks, was diagnosed with advanced heart disease. Hospital visits replaced internships. Medical bills replaced tuition payments. Within months, Naomi withdrew from school, promising herself it would only be temporary. Temporary slowly became 3 years. Days became a careful routine built around responsibility instead of ambition. Morning appointments with cardiologists. Afternoon shifts delivering prescriptions. Evening work wherever steady pay could be found. Catering companies rarely asked about unfinished degrees. They only asked whether she could arrive on time, smile politely, and stay until the last guest had gone home. Naomi always said yes. Every paycheck disappeared almost immediately into rent, medications, groceries, and insurance deductibles. Even so, she never allowed bitterness to settle inside her. Her mother often reminded her that dignity was something no employer could hand out and no stranger could take away. Those words had carried Naomi through countless awkward smiles, dismissive remarks, and invisible moments inside rooms where people discussed generosity while barely noticing those serving their dinner. Tonight had been no different until she saw the painting. It had been visible for only a heartbeat before the velvet cover settled completely into place, but that heartbeat had been enough. The composition looked familiar. Too familiar. The proportions of the ornate, gilded frame matched photographs she remembered studying during graduate seminars. More troubling was the surface itself. Even beneath the warm gallery lighting, the paint reflected light with an unnatural gloss. Authentic oil paintings of that age rarely behaved that way unless they had undergone extremely recent restoration, and no museum report she could remember had ever mentioned such treatment. Then there was the crack allure, the network of tiny age cracks collectors admired. From where she stood, the pattern appeared strangely uniform, almost manufactured instead of naturally formed over decades. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment, replaying the image again and again. Perhaps she was mistaken. Perhaps exhaustion had fooled her after a 14-hour shift. Or perhaps a room filled with some of the wealthiest collectors in America was only minutes away from celebrating something that was not what everyone believed it to be. Inside the ballroom, the atmosphere shifted from casual conversation to polished anticipation as the house lights dimmed just enough to draw every eye toward the stage. Waitstaff quietly disappeared behind the guests while photographers gathered near the velvet ropes, their cameras ready for the evening's signature moment. Richard Whitmore stepped onto the platform with the confidence of a man who had spent 3 decades building companies that shaped skylines and fortunes alike. At 58 years old, he had earned a reputation for discipline, precision, and impossible standards. Every charity gala bearing his name raised millions of dollars. Every event unfolded exactly on schedule, and every detail reflected the image he believed success demanded. His silver hair was neatly combed, his midnight tuxedo flawless, and his calm smile carried the quiet authority that made board members listen before he even spoke. The audience welcomed him with warm applause. Richard acknowledged them with a graceful nod before thanking the sponsors, the hospital foundation, and the museum trustees whose partnership had transformed the evening into one of Chicago's most anticipated charitable events. Behind him, concealed beneath the rich velvet cloth, stood the painting everyone had traveled to see. It had been introduced for weeks as a newly rediscovered masterpiece from a celebrated 19th-century American artist, generously donated by a private collector whose identity remained confidential. Experts predicted the final bid could exceed $12 million, with every dollar pledged toward pediatric heart research. Richard had personally championed the acquisition after respected consultants assured him the artwork had passed every examination. He trusted documents, certifications, and established names. In his world, reputation carried weight because reputation had always rewarded careful preparation. Across the front rows sat museum directors, philanthropists, investment executives, and collectors whose opinions could influence international markets. They admired Richard because he rarely made mistakes. They also expected perfection because he rarely tolerated anything less from the people around him. Earlier that evening, when informed that a server had disrupted the elegant flow of the gala, he had viewed the situation as nothing more than another operational issue requiring immediate resolution. Large events depended upon order. Order depended upon rules. Rules depended upon everyone remaining within clearly defined roles. It never occurred to him that the quiet waitress being escorted from the ballroom possessed knowledge none of his carefully selected experts had recognized. Near the stage, the museum's chief curator adjusted her glasses while reviewing the presentation notes one final time. Two art consultants exchanged confident smiles, pleased that months of planning were finally reaching their conclusion. A representative from the insurance company quietly confirmed the coverage paperwork before stepping aside. Every credential in the room pointed toward authenticity. Every respected voice reinforced the same conclusion. Richard accepted that consensus without hesitation because throughout his career, trusting recognized authorities had become second nature. Outside the ballroom doors, however, Naomi remained standing beneath the covered entrance, unable to silence the growing unease in her chest. She replayed every detail she had noticed from the brief glimpse of the painting. The unusual gloss, the mechanical pattern of surface cracks, the proportions that felt almost perfect instead of naturally aged. None of those observations alone proved deception. Together, they formed a question that refused to disappear. She reached into her apron pocket and found the small notebook she carried for grocery lists and medication reminders. Turning to a blank page, she quickly sketched the unusual crack pattern she remembered seeing beneath the gallery lights. Her pencil stopped halfway across the page. A memory surfaced from an advanced conservation seminar years earlier. Her professor had displayed side-by-side photographs comparing authentic aging with artificially produced craquelure used by sophisticated forgers. The pattern she had just drawn looked disturbingly familiar. Naomi stared at the sketch as the applause inside the ballroom grew louder. Somewhere beyond those grand doors, the velvet cover was about to be lifted. Naomi looked once toward the line of waiting taxis, then back at the glowing entrance where guests continued arriving in tailored suits and elegant evening gowns. Common sense urged her to leave before anyone recognized her again, but another voice, quieter and far more persistent, reminded her that if she walked away now, and her instincts proved correct, thousands of children who depended on the hospital foundation could lose millions of dollars while a forgery earned applause. She tightened her grip on the small notebook and turned back toward the hotel. One of the security officers standing near the revolving doors recognized her immediately. His expression shifted from surprise to concern. "Ma'am, I thought we already asked you to leave." Naomi stopped several feet away, keeping her voice calm and respectful. "I understand. I am not trying to come back to work. I only need 30 seconds with Mr. Whitmore or the museum curator." The officer shook his head politely. "That is not possible. Please," Naomi continued. "I believe the painting prepared for tonight's auction may not be authentic." The words hung in the cool night air for a brief moment before the second officer let out a restrained laugh. "You are saying a room full of experts missed something?" Naomi nodded slowly. "I could be wrong, but there are details that deserve another look before the auction begins." A nearby event manager, Melissa Grant, happened to overhear the conversation while checking guest arrivals on her tablet. She stepped closer with a weary expression that suggested she had already handled too many unexpected problems that evening. "Miss Brooks," she said, recognizing Naomi from the catering roster, "the event is already underway. This is not the time." Naomi met her eyes without raising her voice. "I know exactly how this sounds. I only want someone qualified to examine the surface before the bidding starts. If I am mistaken, I will apologize and leave immediately." Melissa folded her arms. "The painting has already been authenticated by specialists from 2 respected firms. Did either report mention a recent varnish layer or artificially induced crackler? Naomi asked gently. Melissa hesitated for only a fraction of a second. It was enough for Naomi to notice. Before Melissa could answer, applause erupted from inside the ballroom as Richard began introducing the featured artwork. The sound echoed through the grand lobby. Naomi felt her heartbeat quicken. Please, she said again. Once that cover comes off, people will trust what they see because they trust the names behind it. They will not question it afterward. Melissa studied Naomi's face. There was no panic, no anger, no attempt to create attention. Only quiet certainty. Even so, years of event management had taught her that allowing a dismissed employee back into a high-profile gala could become a disaster of its own. She lowered her voice. I cannot interrupt Mr. Whitmore because of a suspicion. Naomi slowly opened her notebook and handed it over. On the page was the sketch she had drawn only minutes earlier, accompanied by several short observations written in neat handwriting. Melissa glanced at the notes without fully understanding them, but one phrase caught her attention. Artificial crack pattern inconsistent with natural aging. Before she could ask another question, a young museum assistant hurried through the lobby carrying a folder of auction documents. Naomi instinctively stopped him. Excuse me, sir. Who performed the final conservation inspection? The assistant answered without thinking. Harrington Fine Art Laboratory. Naomi's expression changed almost imperceptibly. She remembered reading an industry bulletin months earlier announcing that Harrington had outsourced portions of its technical examinations because of staffing shortages. It did not prove anything, but it deepened her concern. She looked back toward Melissa. I am asking you to risk 2 minutes. If I am wrong, nothing changes. If I am right, everything does. Melissa looked from the notebook to the ballroom entrance, her fingers tightening around the tablet she carried everywhere. Every second of hesitation felt heavier than the last. Inside, the audience applauded again as the velvet cover was slowly lifted from the painting. Warm spotlights settled across the canvas, drawing a collective murmur of admiration from the crowd. The masterpiece seemed magnificent at first glance, its rich colors glowing beneath the carefully positioned gallery lights. Richard Whitmore welcomed the reaction with a satisfied smile. Months of planning had finally reached the moment everyone had been waiting for. He thanked the anonymous collector once again and spoke about the importance of preserving history while investing in the future of children fighting life-threatening illnesses. The audience responded with another round of applause. In the lobby, however, Melissa made her decision. She handed Naomi's notebook back without opening it again. I am sorry, she said quietly. Tonight is simply too important. I cannot interrupt the program based on an opinion. Naomi accepted the notebook with steady hands. It is not only an opinion. Melissa offered a sympathetic smile that somehow hurt more than open hostility. Maybe not. But everyone inside has trusted experts, insurance reports, provenance documents, and laboratory certifications. I cannot walk onto that stage and tell them a waitress believes they are all mistaken. The words were polite, yet they landed with unmistakable finality. Before Naomi could answer, another guest passing through the lobby overheard the last sentence. He recognized her immediately from earlier in the evening. Is this the same server who caused the disturbance? He asked with a faint chuckle. Melissa nodded politely without encouraging the conversation. The man smiled toward a small circle of arriving donors. That explains everything. First the spilled drink. Now she wants to lecture museum experts. A few restrained laughs followed. None of them were loud. None of them sounded intentionally cruel. Yet each quiet laugh carried the same message. Naomi did not belong in conversations like these. She lowered her eyes for only a brief moment before looking back at Melissa. Thank you for listening. There was no anger in her voice. No bitterness. Only disappointment that settled quietly between them. She slipped the notebook back into her pocket and turned toward the revolving doors. Behind her, the security officers relaxed, believing the situation had finally ended. Inside the ballroom, Richard invited the chief curator to begin the formal presentation. Large display screens illuminated with close-up images of the painting while guests examined every visible brushstroke from their seats. The curator praised its remarkable preservation and historical significance before announcing the opening bid of $5 million. Auction paddles immediately began rising throughout the room. 6 million. 6.5. 7 million. The numbers climbed with astonishing speed as excitement spread across the audience. Outside, Naomi slowly descended the wide stone steps leading toward the sidewalk. Rain had started again, gentle enough to leave only tiny silver circles across the dark pavement. She stopped beneath a maple tree whose leaves shimmered under the streetlights and looked back at the glowing hotel windows. Somewhere beyond those walls, generous people believed they were changing lives. She desperately wanted them to succeed. That was precisely why she could not ignore what she had seen. Her phone vibrated softly inside her jacket pocket. It was a text message from her mother asking whether the shift had ended safely. Naomi smiled sadly before typing a simple reply. "I will be home soon." She hesitated before pressing send. At that exact moment, another burst of applause echoed faintly through the rain as the bidding climbed even higher. Naomi closed her eyes for one long breath. Something deep inside told her the evening was moving toward a mistake that would become impossible to undo once the final hammer fell. Naomi slipped her phone back into her pocket without sending the message. The glowing screen faded to black, leaving only her reflection for an instant before the rain erased it beneath scattered drops of water. She stood motionless beneath the maple tree while the city moved around her without slowing down. A taxi rolled past, its tires whispering across the wet pavement. Somewhere farther down the block, an elevated train rumbled through the night, its windows streaks of warm light against the dark Chicago skyline. Behind her, the Whitmore Grand Hotel shimmered like another world, every crystal chandelier glowing through enormous windows, while laughter drifted faintly into the cool evening air. Naomi had spent years learning that there were moments when speaking changed nothing, because people had already decided whose voice deserved to be heard. Tonight felt painfully familiar. She reached into her jacket and unfolded the small notebook once more. The sketch remained exactly as she had left it, simple pencil lines capturing the unnatural crack pattern she could not forget. She gently traced one line with her fingertip, remembering Professor Daniel Harper standing before a classroom years earlier. "Never trust what prestige tells you," he had once said. "Trust what the object quietly reveals." Back then she had believed those lessons would carry her into museum laboratories, conservation studios, and international exhibitions. Instead, they had followed her into hospital waiting rooms, grocery stores, and late-night catering shifts. Life had changed her destination, but it had never erased what she had learned. A cool breeze carried the scent of fresh rain and blooming flowers from the hotel's carefully maintained gardens. Naomi watched tiny drops gather along the bronze railing before falling one by one onto the stone steps below. The rhythm was strangely calming. She thought about her mother resting at home, probably reading another library novel beneath the old lamp beside the living room window. Evelyn Brooks never measured success by titles or salaries. She measured it by whether someone chose honesty when dishonesty would have been easier. That lesson had shaped Naomi far more deeply than any university lecture. She finally pressed the button to send her brief text. A second later, another message appeared almost immediately from her mother. "Come home safely. Your heart matters more than any job." Naomi smiled despite the weight pressing against her chest. She whispered, almost to herself, "I am trying." Her eyes drifted once more toward the illuminated ballroom windows. Through the glass, she could make out only blurred silhouettes raising auction paddles beneath brilliant lights. They looked almost like shadows moving inside a snow globe, separated from the ordinary world by polished glass and privilege. She wondered whether any of them realized how quickly certainty could disappear if one overlooked detail surfaced at exactly the wrong moment. She took a slow step toward the sidewalk, determined that she had done everything reasonably possible. No one could accuse her of remaining silent. No one could say she had ignored her conscience. If the experts chose not to listen, that responsibility belonged to them now. She turned away from the hotel and began walking toward the corner where she could request a ride home. After only a dozen steps, the ballroom lights suddenly flickered through the rain as if someone inside had shifted the presentation screens. Almost at the same instant, the distant applause stopped. Not faded. Stopped. Even from half a block away, the silence felt different. Naomi paused instinctively. She slowly turned back toward the hotel. Through the tall windows, she could see people no longer sitting comfortably in their chairs. Figures were standing. Heads were turning toward the stage. Something inside the ballroom had interrupted the carefully choreographed evening, and for the first time since she had been escorted outside, Naomi sensed that the quiet certainty surrounding the painting had begun to crack. Naomi remained frozen beneath the rain as the strange silence inside the hotel stretched for several long seconds. Then the front entrance burst open. Melissa Grant hurried into the lobby, her composed expression replaced by unmistakable alarm. She spoke rapidly with one of the security officers, pointing back toward the ballroom while guests inside began rising from their tables. Something had disrupted the flawless evening Richard Whitmore had spent months orchestrating. On stage, the chief curator had been answering questions from potential bidders when an elderly collector in the front row quietly requested permission to examine the painting through his personal magnifying loupe before placing another bid. No one objected. It was a common courtesy among serious collectors. The curator welcomed him onto the stage with complete confidence. The distinguished collector leaned closer beneath the gallery lights, adjusting his glasses as he studied the lower right corner of the canvas. 10 silent seconds passed. Then another 10. The smile slowly disappeared from his face. Without saying a word, he reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small ultraviolet flashlight that many experienced collectors carried for preliminary examinations. A faint violet beam crossed the lower edge of the painting. The collector inhaled sharply. He whispered something into the curator's ear. Her expression immediately changed. She requested the laboratory representative standing nearby to join them. Within moments, all three stood examining the same small section of the canvas. Richard watched from only a few feet away. He could not hear every word, but one phrase reached him with startling clarity. This restoration layer should not exist. The ballroom that had been filled with effortless conversation only minutes earlier now held an uneasy stillness. Auction paddles lowered. Guests exchanged uncertain glances. Cameras stopped flashing. Richard stepped forward. "Explain what is happening." The laboratory representative hesitated before answering. "There appears to be an inconsistency that requires verification." Richard frowned. "An inconsistency?" The elderly collector looked directly at him. "If this surface behaves the way I believe it does, the attribution deserves immediate review before another bid is accepted." Richard felt the room grow unexpectedly smaller. His eyes returned to the painting. Suddenly, he remembered the event manager mentioning the dismissed waitress who had insisted on speaking with him. A faint memory surfaced. She had not demanded attention. She had not argued about losing her job. She had tried to warn someone about the artwork. He turned sharply toward Melissa, who had just re-entered the ballroom. "The server from earlier," he said. "Where is she?" Melissa blinked in surprise. "Sir." The young woman. Naomi Brooks. Melissa's face lost its remaining color. She said she believed the painting was not authentic. Richard stared at her. "You knew that?" She tried to explain. "I thought." Her voice faded beneath the weight of realization. Richard did not wait to hear the rest. He looked once more at the experts now surrounding the painting, all speaking in cautious voices instead of confident ones. Every second mattered. If Naomi had recognized something before any of them, she might also know exactly what they were missing. Without another word, Richard stepped down from the stage. Guests instinctively moved aside as he crossed the ballroom at a pace no one had ever seen from the normally composed billionaire. He passed beneath the towering chandeliers, through the marble lobby, and straight toward the revolving doors. The security officers hurried to open them before he even reached the entrance. Cold rain swept into the lobby as Richard rushed outside and searched both directions along the sidewalk. Halfway down the block, beneath the glow of a streetlight, he spotted a familiar black jacket disappearing toward the corner. For the first time that evening, the man everyone else had been following began running after the one person no one had believed. Richard Whitmore's polished dress shoes splashed through shallow puddles as he crossed the sidewalk, paying no attention to the rain soaking the shoulders of his tailored tuxedo. "Miss Brooks," he called, his voice carrying farther than he expected through the damp evening air. Naomi stopped at the corner, but did not turn immediately. She assumed someone wanted to return a forgotten badge or remind her that employees were not allowed back onto the property. Only when she heard the footsteps slowing behind her did she look over her shoulder. Richard stood several feet away, catching his breath, his composed expression replaced by something she had never seen earlier that evening. Humility. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The city continued moving around them as headlights reflected across the wet pavement, and a passing bus disappeared into the distance. Finally, Richard broke the silence. "Miss Brooks, I owe you an apology." Naomi looked at him with quiet surprise, but said nothing. Richard continued, choosing each word carefully. "You tried to warn us. I did not listen. My staff did not listen. I judged your position instead of your knowledge, and I was wrong." The honesty in his voice felt almost unfamiliar, even to him. Throughout his career, people usually apologized to Richard Whitmore. He rarely found himself standing in the rain admitting fault to someone he had dismissed only minutes earlier. Naomi lowered her eyes, briefly before meeting his gaze again. "Is the auction still going?" she asked softly. Richard nodded once. "Everything has stopped. Several experts discovered inconsistencies after another collector examined the painting." Naomi took a slow breath. "Then there is still time." Richard glanced toward the hotel. "Will you come back with me?" Naomi hesitated. Memories of whispered laughter, polite dismissal, and countless watching eyes still lingered inside the grand ballroom. Returning meant walking back into the same room where she had been quietly escorted out. Richard seemed to understand her hesitation before she spoke. "I cannot change what happened earlier," he said, "but I can make certain you are heard now." Naomi studied his face for several seconds. She saw no trace of pride left there, only genuine concern that innocent people might be misled and that charitable donations intended for children could become attached to a false masterpiece. She slowly nodded. "I will help because the hospital deserves the truth." Richard gave a grateful smile. "Thank you." Together they walked back toward the glowing entrance, neither speaking as rain continued falling gently around them. When the revolving doors opened, conversations inside the lobby immediately faded. Security officers who had escorted Naomi outside only minutes before stepped aside without being asked. Melissa Grant looked up from across the marble floor, visibly stunned to see Richard personally walking beside the waitress she had turned away. No one spoke as they crossed the lobby. Every pair of eyes followed them toward the ballroom. Inside, the atmosphere had transformed completely. The confident excitement of the auction had disappeared, replaced by anxious whispers and uncertain expressions. The painting remained on its easel beneath bright gallery lights while museum specialists waited beside it. Richard walked directly onto the stage before facing the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said calmly, "before we continue, there is someone I should have listened to from the beginning." He turned toward Naomi and extended his hand, inviting her forward with quiet respect. Hundreds of guests watched as the young woman in the simple black server uniform stepped onto the stage she had been removed from less than an hour earlier. She carried no expensive credentials, no polished presentation, and no title that impressed the room. She carried only careful observation, years of forgotten study, and the courage to speak when remaining silent would have been easier. For the first time that evening, every person in the ballroom was ready to hear what she had been trying to say all along. Naomi stepped beneath the gallery lights with the same quiet composure she had carried while serving tables only an hour earlier. The difference was not in the way she walked, but in the way the room now watched her. Hundreds of guests who had overlooked her presence earlier sat in complete silence as she approached the painting. She did not rush. She did not attempt to impress anyone. Instead, she studied the canvas exactly as she had been trained years before, allowing her eyes to move naturally from the frame to the brushwork, then across the surface where the reflections from the chandeliers revealed details invisible from a distance. Richard Whitmore stood several feet behind her without interrupting. The museum curator handed Naomi a magnifying loupe with hesitant respect. Naomi thanked her, leaned closer, and examined the lower edge of the painting for several long moments. Finally, she looked up. "The composition is beautifully copied," she said calmly. "That is why it convinces people at first glance. But authentic aging is never perfectly organized. Real time is irregular. This pattern is too consistent." She pointed gently toward one corner of the canvas. "The craquelure repeats itself here and here. Natural aging does not create matching patterns like this." Several conservation specialists moved closer. Naomi continued without changing her measured tone. "There is also a modern restoration varnish sitting above pigments that should never have been exposed this way. The ultraviolet reaction confirms it. One of the laboratory representatives quietly repeated the examination with professional equipment. A tense minute passed before he slowly lowered the instrument and nodded. She is correct. Another specialist requested additional imaging. Within minutes, the preliminary findings reached the same conclusion. The painting was not an authentic 19th century masterpiece, but an exceptionally sophisticated modern forgery. A wave of stunned silence settled across the ballroom. No one celebrated exposing the deception because everyone understood how close the foundation had come to building its largest fundraiser around a false work of art. Richard closed his eyes briefly before walking toward Naomi. This time he did not speak from a stage or behind a microphone. He stopped directly in front of her where every guest could see him. "Miss Brooks," he said with quiet sincerity, "tonight you protected this foundation, every donor in this room, and the families who depend on our work. More importantly, you reminded me that wisdom is not determined by a job title, a suit, or a seat at the table. I judged you before I ever listened to you. I am deeply sorry." The ballroom remained completely still. Naomi offered a gentle smile that carried neither triumph nor resentment. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. I accept your apology." She paused before adding softly, "Truth does not belong to the loudest person in the room. Sometimes it simply waits for someone willing to notice it." Richard nodded, visibly moved by the grace she had shown after everything that had happened. Before the evening ended, he announced that the auction would be postponed until every remaining artwork completed an independent review, ensuring every future donation would rest upon honesty rather than assumption. He also publicly invited Naomi to meet with the museum's conservation board about opportunities that matched her education instead of the uniform she happened to be wearing that night. As guests quietly left the ballroom, many stopped to thank Naomi personally. Others simply offered respectful smiles that had been missing only hours before. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The clouds drifted apart, revealing a clear night sky above the city skyline. Naomi stepped onto the hotel entrance one final time, breathing the cool air with peaceful gratitude. Behind her, Richard remained near the doorway, watching as she walked toward the sidewalk with calm confidence. He did not see a waitress leaving the gala anymore. He saw a woman whose integrity had quietly transformed an entire room. The marble steps glistened beneath the first reflections of moonlight, and in the gentle silence that followed, it was no longer status that commanded respect. It was character.